All right, here's our first video in our last section of Chapter 5. We're going to do 5.8 and talk about applications of factoring. I know, everybody's favorite, word problems. I know they're kind of challenging, but the only way that they're going to get better is by practicing. So we'll do a few examples of each type, and then I want you to make sure that you practice, practice, practice. Do the examples again if you need to. Make sure that you do the homework. Do extra problems if you need to make sure that you understand, okay? So, as we're reading through these word problems, make sure, number one, that you read the problem, carefully, and maybe visualize what's happening. If drawing a picture helps, then maybe you can draw the picture of the scenario. Then what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to try to reword the problem and translate it into a math expression or an equation. So can you take it out of words and take those words and translate them into math? Once we have our mathematical expression or equation, we can then solve it and write our answer with correct units so we at least know what the answer means, right? It's one thing to get an answer, but it's really important that you know what the answer means. And then you can always double check and make sure that the answer makes sense. Okay, let's do our first example. Example number 1 says, a number is 30 less than its square. Find the number or numbers. So a number, do we know what the number is? No, not necessarily. So can we call that x? And then is, in math, doesn't that kind of mean equals? So what I'm doing is I'm reading this really carefully. I'm looking at the important words and I'm trying to take these words and make them into math expressions. So some number, x, is equals 30 less than its square. So whatever the number's square is, x squared, we want 30 less than that. So I'm going to make an equation with exactly what this stuff says. It says a number is equal to 30 less than its squared. So if I take the number and square it, x squared, and then I take 30 less than that. Now I don't want to write it as 30 minus x squared. I want to subtract 30 from it. I don't want to subtract it from 30. So you've got to be really careful, especially if it's a subtraction or less than, that if it says you're less than its square, then you're subtracting 30 from it. So that 30 needs to make sure that you go in the back. Well, now that I have this equation, doesn't this kind of look like a quadratic? My steps then, I should be able to bring everything to the same side and set it equal to 0. So I subtracted the x over. I should now be able to factor, looking for a GCF. It looks like this has 3 terms, basic factor problem, so numbers that multiply to negative 30 that add to negative 1. I ended up getting x minus 6 and x plus 5. Since I am all factored and I'm set equal to 0, I can take each factor and set it equal to 0. I end up getting 2 solutions. I get x equals 6 and x equals negative 5. Now let's go back and make sure that we understand what this means. We called x the number. We called the number x, and so that means the number could either be 6 or negative 5. Now, let's double check that this makes sense. If I take 6 and I plug it in to x, does it mathematically make sense? Well, what's 6 squared? 36. What's 36 minus 30? 30 less than 36. Isn't it 6? And so it checks out. Do the same thing for negative 5. If I take negative 5 and I square it, be careful with your squaring your negatives, put it in parentheses, and then I take 30 less than that, let's see if it equals the number. Negative 5 squared, negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25, minus 30 is negative 5. So it checks out too. So then I know that my answers are correct. My number could either be 6 or negative 5, and it would satisfy the requirements. All right, let's look at another one. This one says to just translate. So really the most important part is getting it set up. From there, we've practiced so much factoring and solving by factoring. Hopefully you got that part down. So here's the hardest part, is really just taking these word problems and making them into an equation. So let's practice that on this one. It says 3 more than a number is 9 times the square of the number. 3 more than a number, do we know what the number is? So we can call it x, is, remember equals, 9 times the square of the number. So whatever that number is, squared. So I'm going to take each of these pieces and translate it. 3 more than the number, so whatever the number is, x, and add 3 to it, is equals 9 times whatever that number is squared. 9 times x squared. I can then take the 9 times x squared and kind of combine those and say 9x squared. At this point, I could move everything to the same side and factor it if I wanted to solve it. But remember, this one is just asking us to translate it and just take these words and put them into a mathematical equation. All right, keep practicing on those because we're going to get a little more challenging here in a second.